A long time ago in a galaxy you might be familiar with, my patron Daniel Russell asked, "Hi Tick, as a New Zealander I've always had an interest in my country's war contribution in World War II. Your videos on Operation Crusader was the first video I have ever seen where the New Zealand 2nd Division was shown in excruciating detail. My question is, what was New Zealand's involvement in the Italian theatre when it entered the country from 1943 to 45? Content I've seen about this topic seems to be very scarce, briefly talking about it like it's a little side note, which as a New Zealander really grinds my gears. Cheers, Daniel." Since I suck and I'm so far behind with my Patreon questions that you've been waiting years for a response, I'm going to do one better than that. I'm not going to just focus on the New Zealanders in Italy, I'm going to cover the entire war, from Greece and North Africa all the way through Italy, to assess New Zealand's contribution to the war. My intention with the Battlestorm series is to cover all these battles in detail, and I will talk more about the New Zealanders in those videos. But in the meantime, here is a brief history of the 2nd New Zealand Division during World War II. As a Commonwealth nation, New Zealand didn't technically need to enter the war, but they supported Britain in her ultimatum against Germany over Poland, and so they did join the war on the 3rd of September 1939. The size of New Zealand's standing army at the time, the permanent force, was just 100 officers and 478 other ranks. Bearing in mind that Rambo killed 322 people during his 5 films. So, in terms of numbers, Rambo killed 55.7% of the entire New Zealand army in 1939. Clearly, they needed more troops. There were only 355,000 available men of military age throughout the whole of New Zealand. And obviously you can't recruit all of them because the economy would implode, so there was limited manpower. But 19,000 men were on unemployment benefit or in subsidised work at this stage, so there was some potential there. And when they started the recruitment campaign, the initial recruitment drive saw more than double the hoped for volunteers. Therefore, the New Zealand government found that they could form a full infantry division. At 9 AM on Tuesday 12th of September 1939, the recruiting offices were opened, and when the doors closed that night, 5,419 men had enlisted. The 22nd of July 1940 was the last day for voluntary enlistment in 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force. By then, the total number of voluntary enlistments was 59,644. The 1st New Zealand Division was for home defence, and so Freyberg's 2nd New Zealand Division, with the 4th, 5th and 6th Brigades, was the one sent to the west. During my Operation Crusader video, I showed the fighting subunits of the 2nd New Zealand Division in action, but in case you didn't see that, in addition to the 9 infantry battalions of the division, there were 2 extra battalions as well. The first was the 27th Machine Gun Battalion, and the second was the 28th Maori Battalion. The flag for the Maori Battalion wasn't invented until 1990, so the unit icon here is very much inaccurate, but it's a really cool looking flag, so rule of cool, I've put it in there. The Machine Gun Battalion didn't really fight as a separate unit, as each company was placed in support of the 3 brigades. And the Maori Battalion was created after the other battalions were created first. So the Maori were given a choice of staying with their original units or fighting in this new battalion, so some no doubt decided to serve in the other battalions. The first 3 battalions went overseas in January 1940, with 3 more going to the British Isles that May because of the threat of a German invasion. But the whole division was formed in September 1940 in Egypt minus 1 brigade, and the reason for this was because the British wanted to upgrade this foot infantry division into a motorised division, and Egypt had good training facilities to allow this. Plus, it was of strategic importance, and there was a need for troops in North Africa at this time. General Bernard Freyberg was placed in command of the 2nd New Zealand Division, and though he was British born, Freyberg's family had moved to New Zealand when he was 2.5 years old, so many considered him to be a New Zealander. He was a good swimmer, winning medals doing so, which is perhaps why Freyberg offered to swim ashore to a Turkish beach in order to light oil flares to divert attention away from the main landings elsewhere during the opening moves of the Gallipoli campaign in the First World War. He won the Distinguished Service Order Medal for this, and Freyberg later ended up as a brigadier in charge of the 88th Brigade of the 29th Division, marching through northern France and into Belgium when the war ended. During the battles, the Belgian civilians looked on with keen interest, shouting "Vive l'Anglais," and in many cases rushing after our attacking lines of infantry, which were often under fire, giving the men a kind of hot coffee made from burnt beans. This giving of refreshments threatened to delay the whole attack and became a positive danger to us in the thickly populated parts. He had won the Victoria Cross for most gallant conduct at Beaucou in 1916, been awarded 2 bars to his DSO, been mentioned in dispatches 6 times and wounded 9 times. In 1916-18 he had commanded a battalion or a brigade in almost all the great battles on the Western Front, on the Somme, at Arras and Bullecourt, at 3rd Ypres, on Passchendaele, and in the German offensive in Flanders in 1918. He remained in the army after the war, but was retired in 1937 on medical grounds. Then he was recalled in 1939 when the war broke out, and sort of cheated through his medical exams to get accepted back into the army. The New Zealand government considered him to be an ideal candidate for the new expeditionary force they were setting up because he was experienced, senior in age and rank, and though not native born, he could be considered to be a New Zealander. So he did accept the position and was given his new command on the 22nd of November 1939. And because it was thought that the British had mismanaged the New Zealanders in the First World War, Freyberg was given a special charter that made him responsible to the New Zealand government, not the British government. He was given the power to withdraw his troops from an operation if he thought that casualties were going to be too high. Freyberg was wary of suffering casualties, and perhaps as a result, the New Zealander troops considered Freyberg to be one of their own, even if he technically wasn't. When Freyberg reached Egypt, he was astonished to find that General Wavell had taken the troops of the 2nd New Zealand Division and dispersed them into 6 separate portions all over the Middle East. An argument ensued, and Freyberg had to insist that all his troops be brought back together. This ends up being a critical debate, which we'll come back to throughout the video, and in a nutshell, maybe one of the reasons why the British kept losing in the desert in the early years of the war. And because they had been split up and hadn't yet received all their equipment, Freyberg also decided not to commit his troops to what ended up being perhaps the greatest British offensive in the war, Operation Compass. They were in Egypt, but they weren't ready for that battle. Now, even though the division didn't fight in North Africa at this stage, Freyberg did allow his soldiers to be recruited by Ralph Bagnold's long-range desert group for raids behind enemy lines. In fact, the first patrol in August 1940 had 7 men in it, including 6 New Zealanders, one of whom was English-born. The reason I bring this up is because the Australians like to pound their chests and say that they beat the New Zealanders into battle in the Second World War. No, they didn't. The New Zealanders fought in North Africa in 1940 in the Long Range Desert Group, whereas the Australian government forbade their troops to be part of that unit, meaning that they only entered combat in North Africa in 1941 during Operation Compass. Also, technically before this, the New Zealanders helped the British out inside Egypt when the Italians declared war. Does it count as fighting? Maybe not, but it's worth considering. In Alexandria, New Zealanders on leave from the Sidi Bishir rest camp joined the street patrols of the Coldstream Guards, but there was little trouble. The fascist leaders in the Italian colony had been arrested, and life in the cities went on as before. Though they didn't directly take part in the fighting, small New Zealander units did help out during Operation Compass, ferrying troops and supplies and performing engineering tasks. Then, in one of the more controversial moves of the war, thanks to Churchill, the 2nd New Zealand Division was shipped to Greece in 1941. The Germans went around the line that they had erected in Greece, compelling the British, Australian and New Zealand forces to fall back under constant assault. The New Zealand troops put up a spirited defence at the Servia and Olympus passes, but once they had been outflanked again, they were forced to retreat over difficult terrain and under repeated air attacks. At one stage, both 23rd and 28th Maori battalions were surrounded and had to fight their way out. Freyberg and most of his force were evacuated, but 261 New Zealanders were killed, 387 were wounded, and 1,856 were captured. None of this could be blamed on Freyberg, and the New Zealanders themselves had fought very stubbornly. The whole Greek campaign was a debacle from the beginning, and really was the fault of Churchill. But Freyberg has been blamed on occasion for the next battle that the New Zealanders fought at, which is a controversial battle in and of itself. I still intend to do a Battlestorm Crete at some point, going into massive detail, and I'll cast judgment then, but for now I'll just give the standard account. Freyberg was put in charge of Crete and only had 2 of his own brigades because one had been sent back to Egypt after Greece. He only had the 19th Australian Infantry Brigade, 6,000 British troops, several Greek battalions, and very little air support or heavy weapons. They'd actually lost most of their equipment when they had evacuated from Greece, and some were even compelled to leave their rifles behind by the Royal Navy embarkation officers. In fact, many artillerymen and specialist troops, without their artillery or heavy equipment, ended up fighting as infantry during the Battle of Crete. It was not unusual to find that the men had no arms or equipment, no plates, knives, forks or spoons, and they ate and drank from bully beef or cigarette tins. There was no unit transport and no tools for most of the battalions. The morale of some of the odds and ends was low. A temporary 10th New Zealand Brigade was formed from 2 New Zealand battalions and 2 battalions of Greek infantry. Freyberg wasn't allowed to destroy the airfields on the island or take any steps that might reveal that British ultra-intelligence was a thing, and so he was heavily handicapped. Wavell told Freyberg that he was to be given the ultra-intelligence, but as Freyberg had never heard of ultra, Wavell had to tell him what it was. Having briefed him about ultra, Wavell then gave Freyberg 2 specific orders. First, he was not to mention the existence of Ultra to anyone else on Crete. Second, he was never to take any action as a result of what he learnt from Ultra alone. Wavell emphasised that this was a fundamental rule which must be strictly obeyed and could not be varied without his personal authorisation. If the rule was not adhered to, there was a danger that the enemy might realise that his codes had been broken. He was given intelligence that said there was going to be a combined airborne and amphibious assault of up to 35,000 men, which Freyberg said before the battle began that, due to logistical constraints, he didn't have sufficient strength to stop both. Worse, after he had placed his men facing the beaches, because his initial briefings suggested an amphibious landing, new intelligence informed him that it was mainly going to be an airborne assault. But he couldn't change his dispositions because that would reveal Ultra. So he was stuck. Imagine being in that scenario, knowing that you're about to fight a battle with your forces misplaced and there was nothing you were allowed to do to prepare them. And true enough, when the Germans did land, Freyberg had to protect the 3 airfields on the island, which split up his already inadequate and misplaced forces. To make matters worse, his subordinates, especially Brigadier Hargust, commander of 5th Brigade, made mistakes during the battle which effectively made an already bad situation hopeless. The only reason the Germans lost so many men is because General Student thought that the cowardly British forces wouldn't fight, and so dropped a good portion of his men right on top of the British garrisons themselves. He was mistaken, because the British did fight, and the bulk of the Fallschirmjäger was set upon immediately and killed. But once the Germans had captured the main airfield in the west, they were able to receive sufficient supplies and reinforcements to march west and overwhelm the British forces. Freyberg had no choice but to call for an evacuation. Crete was a disastrous battle for the New Zealand division. The ordeal exposed the inability of its veteran senior commanders to react quickly enough to the ever-changing challenges of mobile warfare and greatly reduced the strength and morale of the combat units. The battle cost the division 671 killed in action, 967 wounded and evacuated, and 2,180 captured, including 488 wounded, a total of 3,818 men out of the 7,702 New Zealanders on the island. After 6 months of replenishment, the division was ready for combat again and took part in Operation Crusader, one of the most insane battles of the entire war. I've already done Crusader videos, so I'll not recount what happened again. Go back and watch that for the full explanation. But essentially, the New Zealanders were tasked with relieving Tobruk, and during this swirling mess of a battle, Freyberg managed to push up to and link up with the Tobruk garrison. But Rommel counterattacked, surrounding the 5th Brigade's headquarters at Sidier's Eyes, and did a lot of damage. 100 men were killed or wounded, and about 700 men were captured, including Brigadier Hargest. It turns out that the majority of the prisoners were held at Bardia, which was then captured by the British a few weeks later, and thus 650 of these men were freed again, along with 521 other prisoners. Rommel also attacked the other New Zealand brigades during the battle surrounding Moore and battering them. The British armour was unable to intervene, and Pienaar deliberately didn't go to help them, despite several orders to do so, including some from Freyberg himself. Again, this really wasn't Freyberg's fault, and after this debacle he withdrew the badly beaten division back to Egypt. It was on this occasion that Generals Freyberg and Auchinleck clashed over the latter's intention to commit 5th New Zealand Brigade to an operation that promised heavy casualties. Frustrated at the lack of support, especially from the British armour, Freyberg invoked his special charter. He was bitterly critical of the prevailing 8th Army tendency to deploy in brigade-sized jock columns and static boxes that were easily surrounded and destroyed by Rommel's armoured thrusts. Crusader was the worst battle for the 2nd New Zealand Division during the entire war. It cost them 879 men killed, 1,700 wounded, and 2,042 prisoners. What I want to point out is that Freyberg had the special charter and could pull his division away, but didn't. Right? He was willing to commit it to battle. Pienaar wasn't willing to commit his troops to battle, and so we can really see the contrast between a good commander, Freyberg, and a bad one, Pienaar. Freyberg rebuilt his division in Lebanon, and in June 1942, after the fall of Bir Hakeim during the Battle of Gazala, which I'll have a Battlestorm video on soon, the division was sent back to North Africa, this time to help defend Mersa Matruh. Freyberg defended the escarpment of Minkar Kayam, but unfortunately Auchinleck had decided to retreat, without the New Zealanders realising this. There's a debate about whether they were told or not, and I don't want to wade into that now, but either way, they didn't retreat when the rest of the British army did. Freyberg's flank was therefore no longer protected by the British armour, as Rommel sent 4 Axis divisions against Freyberg, who was quickly surrounded. Getting wounded in the neck during this fighting, Freyberg mounted a successful overnight breakout using bayonets and small arms to surprise and overrun some of the 21st Panzer Division. They managed to reach Egypt for the loss of another 922 casualties, which is surprisingly small given the circumstances. Unfortunately, the New Zealanders under Freyberg had escaped. This division, with which we had already become acquainted back in 1941-42, was among the elite of the British Army, and I should have been very much happier if it had been safely tucked away in our prison camps instead of still facing us. Being wounded, Freyberg was temporarily replaced by Brigadier Lindsay Inglis, who refused Auchinleck's order for the New Zealanders to be split up into brigade groups to defend the southern end of the El Alamein line. Early on the 29th of June, General Inglis, having failed to find General Norrie, went on to 8th Army's tactical headquarters to see Auchinleck. He protested about the situation in which the 6th Brigade had been placed and obtained authority to draw transport and anti-tank guns for it. Auchinleck told him that the 2nd New Zealand Division would be under 13th Corps, and that he was to reorganise it into battle groups. When he objected, he was told he was being given an order. To this, Inglis replied that he was sorry, but it was an order with which he must refuse to comply. The expected explosion did not follow. I was merely asked why I objected and what I proposed to do. The reason was that if I broke up the division and dispersed it over a wide front, I had about as much chance of stopping Rommel as a piece of tissue paper would have had, and my intention was to keep the division concentrated in a central position so that it could fight if it were attacked, and could have at the enemy if the latter tried to bypass us. The matter was dropped there and then so far as we were concerned. They therefore fought as one at the First Battle of El Alamein, almost destroying the Italian Arete armoured division. Even the Italian General Staff's own history admits that the Italian ammunition was exhausted and that they lost practically all their guns. However, when the New Zealanders faced the Germans on the 14th of July, they attacked a strong position and then were counterattacked by German panzers. The British armour failed to help, and so Inglis ordered a withdrawal. A total of 1,405 casualties were sustained, most of them killed or taken prisoner. The officers and men of the New Zealand division were enraged, calling the tank crews cowards. But the New Zealand official history points out that the armour was in a dire state at this point, and it's not exactly a fair accusation since the tank crews were as much the victims of the previous failures and of the higher commands as the New Zealanders were. Some of the officers were pointing this out at the time. We were disappointed in the action of the armour in failing to support us, disappointed and bitter. We do not know what difficulties prevented them, but we do know that many of the men whom we have freely charged with cowardice have had their tanks destroyed under them half a dozen times, and that almost every armoured unit, owing to losses, is an amalgamation of several units. That said, it is reasonable to blame the British armoured commander Lumsden for the problem, but that's a debate for another day. It was this incident that finally persuaded Freyberg that the New Zealanders needed their own armoured brigade, and so the 4th New Zealand Brigade was withdrawn to be turned into an armoured one. On the 21st to the 22nd of July 1942, the New Zealanders then attacked into the Alamein Depression, where the Germans counterattacked, surrounded, and then overran the 6th Brigade. Riflemen went to earth and tried to use their rifles and brain guns against the ring of fire. The spraying tracer compelled most of them to hug the ground. Those who could distinguish anything at all saw only the tops of tanks through the dust and in the half-light. Vickers gunners, some on the ground and some still on trucks, tried to subdue the fire but without result. One after the other, and sometimes together, the guns were destroyed or their crews killed or wounded. 904 men were lost. The division's total casualties at Minkar Kayam and El Mirira were 4,721 men, of whom 822 were killed, 2,080 wounded, and 1,819 taken prisoner. In the aftermath of these defeats, the men of the New Zealand division were bitter. Few of them had faith in the higher commands, and even started criticising other units in the army, believing themselves to be the only unit capable of actually fighting. As their own officers pointed out at the time, yes, they were good troops, and yes, they had been let down, but other units were fighting hard too, and they said that the criticism should be toned down. But there was no doubt that the 8th Army Command needed sorting out. Churchill had lost confidence in Auchinleck by this point and visited the 8th Army in August. He dismissed Auchinleck and his staff officers, replacing them with Generals Alexander and Gott. But Gott was killed the very next day when his airplane was shot down, so Montgomery was given command of the 8th Army. There's a huge debate about how good or bad Monty was as a commander and as a person. But the official New Zealand history makes clear that Monty immediately made their situation a lot easier. Previously, Freyberg had been at odds with both Wavell and then Auchinleck, as well as Anthony Eden at one point, simply because none of them could understand why Freyberg wanted his division to fight as a division rather than be split up into useless penny packet brigade groups that could be destroyed piecemeal. Well, Monty visited and spoke to Freyberg, who once again told him that he wasn't going to allow his division to be split up, as his charter dictated. Freyberg explained that the previous commanders had this obsession with splitting the formations up into groups and jot columns, and he wasn't going to allow it. Much to Freyberg's relief, Montgomery maintained his own dislike of the employment of troops in penny packets and of tying them up in isolated boxes. In fact, so closely did the two generals agree in principle that Freyberg never had open recourse to his charter during the rest of the campaign in Africa. Only when Generals Alexander and Montgomery arrived on the Middle East scene in the summer of 1942 were the realities of the situation acknowledged, the Dominion troops treated separately from the British Army, and everyone's time and energies at last released to concentrate on defeating the enemy. But in addition to this, Monty simplified the orders. Rather than have the troops in 3 different areas, forward, main and rear, he simply told them to hold the forward positions. Again, Freyberg was in complete agreement with Monty, and regardless of Monty's personal failings later on, he was a much needed change for the British at this time. On a personal level, Montgomery and Freyberg got on well together, and there were few of the disagreements that had marred the latter's relationship with earlier commanders-in-chief and army commanders. Later on, admittingly, Freyberg began to grow doubtful about certain aspects of Montgomery's behaviour. His growing personal vanity, his arrogance and intolerance towards those who disagree with him, and his open contempt for the Americans. And after the war, Freyberg was saddened by Montgomery's lack of loyalty to some of his old colleagues. But for the duration of the Desert War, Montgomery and Freyberg worked together harmoniously. However, by September 1942, the 2nd New Zealand Division had just 11,500 men left, which was not much more than half strength. So Monty assigned them the 9th Armoured Brigade and gave them the task of punching a hole in the Axis defences on the 23rd of October during the opening phase of the Second Battle of El Alamein. This attack was successful, and for Operation Supercharge on the 1st of November, Freyberg was given another armoured brigade, 2 more brigades of infantry and 12 artillery regiments. It took 3 days, but these smashed through the Axis defences, and the Axis started their retreat. The Second Battle of El Alamein and the subsequent pursuit of the enemy to the Libyan border cost the division 380 killed or died of wounds, 1,290 wounded, and just 41 prisoners of war. Freyberg conducted a couple of flank attacks during the Axis retreat to Tunisia, at El Agheila on the 11th of December 1942, and at Nophilia on the 15th of January 1943. A few days later, on the 23rd, the New Zealanders captured Tripoli and rested there until March 1943 as Axis forces fell back to the Mareth Line. On the 20th of March, the newly created New Zealand Corps, which had the 2nd New Zealand Division, some British armour and a Free French unit in it, went around the flank of the Mareth Line and attacked the Tabaga Gap. But the defenders were ready, and so the attack was postponed until the next night in an effort to reduce casualties. The night attack by the 6th Brigade took 1,100 Italian prisoners. However, in the hard slog that followed, it took 4 days for the infantry to clear the hills on the right of the gap. Freyberg was criticised for not immediately pushing his armour forward, but it later became clear that the Germans had reinforced the Tabaga area with 2 more divisions, and were well entrenched several miles further ahead. Over the past 2 years, there had been more than enough instances of British commanders throwing their tanks away on deadly pack fronts of German anti-tank guns. Their final action in North Africa was in April 1943 with attacks around Enfidaville and Takruna. The Italians there offered stubborn resistance and the Maori battalion took heavy casualties, but Takruna village was eventually taken. After this, the New Zealanders returned to Egypt for rest and refit, and their total casualties between March and May 1943 have been another 385 killed, 1,284 wounded, and 31 prisoners. So, 6,000 soldiers were granted a 6-month furlough, and the 4th New Zealand Armoured Brigade rejoined the division. The New Zealanders were sent to Italy in 1943 and marched up the eastern side of the Boot, moving up to the German Gustav Line. They then succeeded in crossing the Sangro River, which was part of that line, but the attack on the hilltop town of Ausonia proved a tough nut to crack. The 6th Brigade was actually thrown out of the town, and the fighting therefore ended with the Germans holding the line. Freyberg actually wanted his division to take part in the Anzio landings, with Freyberg saying that he would have been more aggressive than the US 6th Corps and that they would have been in Rome. But this was not to be. Monty also wanted to take Freyberg and his division to Normandy, but was denied by the New Zealand government. And I can't help but think that it would have made sense for Freyberg to have gone to France and Belgium, considering that he knew the ground. He'd fought there in the First World War as a brigade commander and had done a remarkable job. But it wasn't to be. Instead, Freyberg ended up at Cassino with the 4th Indian Division, another veteran of the North African campaign. A new unit, the New Zealand Corps, was formed with the 2nd New Zealand Division, the 4th Indian, and later the British 78th Divisions, all under Freyberg's command. The New Zealand Corps attacked Cassino in February 1944, which was the second time Cassino was attacked, after the US 2nd Corps had failed to crack it in January. The long-established Cassino defences were manned by the crack German 1st Paratroop Division. Always wary of sustaining unnecessary casualties, Freyberg, backed by General Tucker of 4th Indian Division, argued that the monastery on the summit of Monastery Hill, which dominated 2nd New Zealand Division's frontage for the attack, was being used by the Germans to observe Allied movements, and that it needed to be destroyed before he could move. This decision is still controversial. Freyberg realised that it would be a controversial action, but thought it would be right if it meant saving lives. I'm not going to get into this debate today because it warrants its own video, and we'll need time to wade through all the evidence. If you want me to do a specific video on the bombing of Monte Cassino, let me know in the comments and I'll get onto it. For now, all that matters is that after the bombing, the Germans definitely did occupy the building and turned it into a fortress, undermining the effectiveness of the bombing and calling into question Freyberg's decision. In general, Italy was a slog for everyone, including the New Zealanders. At one point in February, the Maori Battalion got a couple of companies across the Rapido River and then were counterattacked by panzers, losing 128 of the 200 men that had crossed. In March, Cassino Town was destroyed by another force of US bombers, and the Third Battle of Monte Cassino commenced. The Fallschirmjäger were once again helped by the rubble created by the bombs, and house-to-house fighting bogged down the attack. Freyberg was criticised here again for not committing his reserves earlier, only doing so late on the 19th of March after heavy casualties had been sustained. But when the reserves went in, they got bogged down as well. The two battles at Cassino had cost the division 211 killed, 1,156 wounded, and 141 missing. And in the 5 months in Italy, it had suffered 3,200 casualties. The New Zealand Corps was disbanded yet again on the 26th of March, and Freyberg was back as commander of 2nd New Zealand Division. It was now placed in a holding position in the line and was in desperate need of reinforcements. The disbanded 3rd New Zealand Division in the Pacific brought in 4,000 veteran troops, and they then went to the Gothic Line in July 1944, after which they were transferred to the Adriatic coast, where the rain bogged down the attacks. In December 1944, the New Zealanders forced the Germans back to the Senio River, but had to wait there until better weather came in spring. The division still had a shortage of men, so the divisional cavalry and the 27th Machine Gun Battalion were converted into regular infantry battalions. They joined the 22nd Battalion in a new 3rd Brigade numbered the 9th. Over half of the New Zealand division that eventually crossed the River Senio on the 9th of April 1945 had never been in action before, but this proved to be an advantage. The rejuvenated force found its feet in a matter of days, and the remaining old hands were quick to acknowledge that the division had once again regained its old bounce and vitality. So that April, the final push into the Po River Valley began, and the 2nd New Zealand Division punished the German Volksjäger, getting revenge for Crete and Cassino. They reached Venice and then secured the city of Trieste from Tito's Yugoslav partisans, who were trying to keep hold of the city and just hoping the Allies wouldn't let them have it. Freyberg didn't let them have it. In his last campaign, Freyberg had been able, over 3 weeks, to keep up the momentum of the advance for over 250 miles, in which the division took almost double their own number of prisoners. This was achieved at a cost of fewer than 250 New Zealanders killed in action. And it's worth remembering that New Zealand is a small country, and so her army in the Second World War was also small. But they actually contributed a lot considering their size. There were only 355,000 available men of military age in the entire country, and of them 135,000 served overseas. That's almost half. And that number is 12% of the total population. On top of this, 36,038 would become casualties. That's 24 per 1,000 population. The UK's casualty rate was only 15 per 1,000, Australia 13, and Canada 9. So New Zealand contributed more than her fair share. And through no fault of their own, Freyberg and the 2nd New Zealand Division had started the war on a bad footing. Greece, Crete, and then the problematic episodes in North Africa meant that they were constantly facing defeat. However, the men and officers of the division fought well. Yes, there was the odd bad decision here or there, but that's expected. Apart from Crete though, the other battles definitely can't be blamed on the New Zealand division. From Alamein onwards, the division really does become a vital element of the British army. Montgomery praised both it and Freyberg, and Churchill nicknamed Freyberg the Salamander for his ability to walk through enemy fire and not die. Italy was a slog for everyone, not just the New Zealanders, and apart from Freyberg's request to bomb Monte Cassino, the division conducted itself very well. Again, there was the odd mistake, but nothing major. So it's hard not to conclude that this was a decent unit, and one of the best that the British fielded in the entire war. Freyberg was a decent division commander, and he survived the war. But when one of his old war wounds from Gallipoli ruptured in 1963, he died shortly after. He has become a hero in the eyes of many. And I just want to point out that this is the first time I've really spoken about the Italian campaign in any real depth. I know it was only a quarter of the video, but I've never spoken about it before. My intention with the Battlestorm series is to go through North Africa, then Sicily, Italy, and then we get to Normandy. So we will get to Italy at some point, and I'll go into massive amounts of depth then, and I'll cover the New Zealanders as well. But we've got to admit that the Italian campaign from 1944 onwards is a sideshow compared to what happened in France or the Eastern Front. And that's okay. It doesn't mean we should ignore it, but it does mean that for the last year of the war, the New Zealanders are in a sideshow campaign that ended up being fairly static until the last months of the war. So I can understand why some people may not care too much about North Africa or the Italian campaign, and I can understand why the New Zealanders haven't had more books written about them. Daniel said that this grinds his gears, but I don't think it's really because people don't like New Zealand or are ignoring them in the narrative. It's just the nature of the beast. They're in a sideshow. Therefore, they're not given as much attention as they really should. As I said, there's limited sources on the New Zealanders themselves. One of the sources I've used for this is Stack and O'Sullivan's book on the New Zealand Expeditionary Force in World War II, which isn't super detailed but provides a nice intro to the topic similar to this video. Another is the Official History of New Zealand, which is free to access online and consists of multiple books. I'll leave links in the description for that. It was compiled in the 1950s and 1960s. There's multiple authors, and it's really detailed. A little bit out of date now, it doesn't mention Ultra, and some of the debates have moved on since then, but there's not a great deal of sources specifically on the New Zealanders alone, so it remains a critically valuable source. Finally, there's a book written on Freyberg by Freyberg's son titled Bernard Freyberg, VC, Soldier of Two Nations. Obviously biased in favour of his father, but the most detailed source specifically on Freyberg himself. I hope that was a sufficient answer to your question, Daniel. Apologies for the delay, and apologies to all the other patrons who've asked questions and I've not yet got back to. I don't know when, but I will answer your questions eventually. So, thanks for supporting, thanks for watching, bye for now.